Hello, this is Dfpolis with another Open Philosophy video. This video is my second response to Wisdom in Nature 7, and in it I'm responding to his video, A Rejoinder to Dfpolis on Truth. In my last response to him, I tried to deal with his arguments in a not too technical way. In this video, I'm going to show in detail and technically exactly what's wrong with his arguments. In addition, I'm going to call him on his gamesmanship. Instead of dialoguing on the differences in our positions, Wisdom in Nature 7 has chosen to engage in gamesmanship. There are several instances of this in his last two videos. First, despite the fact that I introduce myself at the beginning of each video, and so he should know how to pronounce my name, he insists on calling me Paulus as opposed to Polis. Secondly, he refers to my theory of truth, the correspondence theory of truth, as homemade, when he knows that many philosophers, indeed the majority of philosophers, hold the correspondence theory of truth. Thirdly, he insists that I'm an apologist. This shows invincible ignorance on the distinction between philosophy and theology. I've pointed out to him that I'm not defending any particular religion. He insists that since I philosophize in the same tradition as Aristotle and Aquinas, that I'm defending the Catholic faith. It is not merely that he doesn't understand the difference between faith and reason, but he seems constitutionally unable or unwilling to grasp it. This inability to grasp something which is fairly obvious is referred to as invincible ignorance. Now you may wonder why an atheist, like Wisdom in Nature 7, is arguing with me about the nature of truth. And the answer is that the correspondence understanding of truth leads to the rejection of some important claims by naturalists. In particular, Alvin Plantinga was able to show that evolution cannot guarantee the veracity of our thoughts. Evolution tests for behavior, and many different thoughts can give rise to the same behavior. For example, we might think that a tiger is a friendly beast, and that in order to make friends with him, we should run away. Therefore, we will respond with the appropriate behavior, running from a tiger, while having completely wrong ideas about what a tiger is and the danger it represents. Now, the original video, which Wisdom in Nature 7 made on this subject, seems to have disappeared off of YouTube. I assume he thought the better of it, but he's posted another one which argues the same point. Here are some excerpts.
Truth of this definition is a matter of semantic correspondence, wherein the words within a sentence, such as the cat sat on the mat, match the reality that causes the belief.
Of course, this is not what the correspondence theory says at all. Let's take a look at a logic book and see what the correspondence theory actually is as far as most philosophers are concerned. Here's a standard textbook on philosophical logic. Now I'm going to read the definition of the correspondence theory. Page 151. The correspondence theory says that to describe a statement as true is to say that it corresponds with or accords with the facts. For example, if we were to say that the sun is not shining, that would be a true statement if, when we looked out the window, we saw that there was no sun shining. But the word not in the sun is not shining doesn't match any reality. There is no element of reality which matches one for one with not. It's rather that the entire thought, the sun is not shining, corresponds with reality. Thus there is no question of matching words as Wisdom in Nature 7 seems to think. And in fact, we will see that what he says is truth is nothing more than the correspondence theory, because he is going to shortly tell us that when the subject is doing what the predicate says it's doing, then things are true. And that is exactly the correspondence theory. So we can conclude that wisdom in Nature 7 simply doesn't know what he's talking about when it comes to criticizing theories of truth.
Now, there probably are a number of things wrong with this, but the one that is of interest to me is the definition of truth that's involved. You see, I don't really think that truth is a matter of correspondence to causal reality. Truth is a much simpler semantic property as far as I'm concerned, in that it's simply a property that a sentence has when its subject does what its predicate says. So the cat sat on the mat is simply true when and only when the cat, the subject, sits on the mat, the predicate.
Now, the most sensible interpretation of what Wisdom in Nature 7 has just said is to assume that he means by the subject, the cat, an actual cat, which we're referring to. But he did not say that. Literally, the subject, the cat, is the text string, the cat, the words, the cat, and the predicate is the words, sits on the mat. So we can give his example a sensible interpretation, which supports the correspondence theory, or we can take him at his word that he does not mean the correspondence theory, as he has made no mention of the reference of the cat. That is to say, he's not talked about the fact that the words, the cat, refer to an actual cat, and that the words sitting on the mat refer to actual sitting on the map. So we have two interpretations. One is the sensible interpretation, which is the correspondence theory, and another is a rather absurd interpretation, where we take what Wisdom in Nature is saying literally, as the subject, namely words, are doing what the predicate says. Either way, what he has said makes no sense, because the first interpretation supports the correspondence theory, which he rejects, and the second theory is just ridiculous.
Therefore, any issue to do with truth that isn't entirely trivial is a matter of justification. Now, I think the issue of justification, or justification itself, is best achieved within certain theories which are predictably accurate, offer good explanations, and are best protected against the errors to which our cognitive faculties are actually indeed prone to. Now, I would humbly suggest that natural science theories, including biology, are our best theories by these standards. Therefore, it seems to me that naturalistic evolution can both account for the errors that we tend to make in our cognitive reasoning, and for the presence of certain capacities which can be tied together within a culture of good scholarship to dramatically improve the reliability of our cognitive faculties.
Now, if you've been paying attention, you'll notice that Wisdom in Nature 7 has done absolutely nothing to rebut Plantinga's argument. He has not said anything about why what we think ought to correspond with reality. Rather, he assumes that we have mental faculties capable of representing reality adequately, and that we can apply these best if we use the scientific method. For the scientific method to work, we have to have the ability to understand reality as it is, and that behavioral approaches, such as the theory of evolution, do not explain why what is in the mind corresponds to reality. Now, Wisdom in Nature 7 doesn't like corresponding to reality because he confuses correspondence with some kind of one-to-one correspondence between words and elements of reality, which is just a total misunderstanding. But he does say that a sentence is true when the subject is doing what the predicate says it's doing. In other words, it's true when we look out at reality and see that it matches what we've said, what's in our mind.
However, in my Dfpolis Truth and Naturalism video,
I criticised his claim that the only way for a theory to be open is for it to correspond to observed reality. That is, his assertion that there is no possible situation wherein theory T is open and thus its statements truth apt without T corresponding to observed reality.
Of course, this is a distortion of what I actually said. Let's look at my video and see what it is that I did say. Imagine a card. On the front of the card is written, "The sentence on the other side of this card is true." On the back of the card is written, "The sentence on the other side of this card is false." There is no combination of true and false which can be assigned to the two sentences, which allows these statements to be consistent. So it appears that even well-defined, meaningful sentences don't have to be true or false. How can this be? The first sentence refers to something real, namely a sentence on the back of the card, and the sentence on the back of the card also refers to something real, namely the sentence on the front of the card. The problem, however, is that the two sentences taken jointly, the system, refers to nothing other than itself. Therefore, it is closed. A closed system makes no reference to human experience or to the world outside of itself. Now, let's consider a different card. On the front of it is the same sentence, namely, the sentence on the other side of this card is true. But when we turn the card over, we find a very different sentence, namely, the earth is mostly covered with water. This different sentence points outside of the system of sentences to the real world, to the world of experience. And because it does, we can check whether it is true or false. Does it agree with our experience, or does it not agree with our experience? Thus, it is only when we are speaking of things available to human experience that it makes sense to think our statements are true or false. If we're speaking of something other than human experience, like other sentences which don't ultimately refer to human experience, the idea of truth and falsity just simply doesn't apply. I want you to notice that Wisdom in Nature 7 follows a common strategy used by naturalists, for example by Daniel Dennett. The strategy is redefine and rebut. That is to say, you take a word, you change its meaning, and then you show that the word with the new meaning is incompatible with reality. Let's look at some examples. First, Wisdom in Nature 7 redefined truth as Alvin Plantinga used it. Plantinga essentially showed that evolution is incapable of providing us with a faculty wherein what is in our mind agrees with reality most of the time. The word truth is simply a term which Plantinga used in order to describe this state of affairs. Changing the definition of truth, as Wisdom in Nature 7 seems to want to do, doesn't really rebut the argument. Secondly, here I've defined openness to be referring to reality. Now, Wisdom in Nature 7 changing the definition of openness to apply to a different kind of openness is really not addressing what I said. It's merely changing definitions, and that is the fallacy of equivocation.
As part of my criticism, I clearly refuted his claim with a straightforward counter-example, wherein a theory formulated in Tarski semantics manages to be open without corresponding to observed reality.
Of course, his counterexample is not a counterexample at all, given my definition of openness. Rather, it's an example of how something can be open when open is defined in a completely different and inconsistent way. Let's take a look at it.
That self-referential paradoxes can be avoided by marking the difference between the language being studied, the object language, and the metalanguage, which is used to make statements about the object language. To demonstrate this difference, Tarski formalizes it as follows. Where the grammatical subject, the sentence, snow is white is in object language, whilst the predicate is true and the proposition snow is white are in metalanguage.
For those of you who may have had a hard time following this, it's because Wisdom in Nature 7 is very confused in his explanation of what's going on here. The quoted sentence, "the snow is white," is indeed in object language. However, once you put it in quotes, then it becomes a name in metalanguage. So the entire sentence is in fact in metalanguage. It is not a mixture of two languages, as you might assume by looking at the slide.
Once grasped, this distinction can be applied to the liar paradox, so that in "this sentence is false," the predicate is false is in metalanguage, thus breaking the problematic self-reference. Similarly, with regard to Jourdain's paradox, the sentence on the other side of this card would, on either side of the card, be in object language, whilst "is false" and "is true" would both be in metalanguage.
Here's part of my response. Tarski is quite clear that his analysis applies only to formal languages and not to natural languages such as English. To see why this is the case, let's take a perfectly simple English language statement which would be admissible as evidence in any court of law. The sentence is, "I was not there, and that's the truth." This sentence is self-referential because "and that's the truth" refers to part of the sentence. According to the rules which Wisdom in Nature 7 has laid down for us, this sentence is totally unacceptable and has no truth value one way or the other. Certainly, judges and juries would think differently when they compared this sentence to the facts of the case. If the evidence showed that the defendant was in fact there, they would know that he is lying. Those of you who've looked at my video too, and then at Wisdom in Nature 7's criticism, will notice that he skipped part of my video. He skipped the example in which the statement on the other side of the card was, "The earth is mostly covered with water." Why did he skip this example? Because it is completely inconsistent with his theory. This set of statements, "the statement on the other side of the card is true," and "the world is mostly covered with water," again, are perfectly acceptable in English. There is no reason why a statement such as, "the statement on the other side of this card is true," should be rejected as meaningless. It can only be rejected as meaningless in contexts such as that provided by Jourdain's paradox. When the statement on the other side of the card is empirically verifiable or falsifiable, like "the earth is mostly covered with water," then the set of two statements is perfectly acceptable. But on Wisdom in Nature 7's theory, we must reject this sentence as meaningless. Thus Wisdom in Nature's theory falls prey to the old adage, "He who proves too much proves nothing." Wisdom in Nature has proven too much. He's proven that perfectly acceptable English language statements are not sensible, and of course this is ridiculous.
Firstly, he denies claiming that correspondence to observed reality is necessary for theoretical openness, insisting that he only meant to suggest that it is sufficient.
First of all, the purpose of my original video, video 2, which is the one he's concentrating on, was to show that we can resolve paradoxes such as Jourdain's paradox without recourse to the apparatus of metalanguage versus language.
However, I do not accept this because it contradicts our natural understanding of what he himself said. Polis first drew my attention to his video by claiming in a correspondence that paradoxes of self-reference show that truth requires reference to reality.
Notice the shameless bait-and-switch tactics which Wisdom in Nature 7 is employing here. He begins by talking about openness, and then he switches the topic to reference and truth. Of course, they're linked, But the kind of openness he's talking about means incompleteness, and that's very different from the kind of openness which I'm considering, which means the ability to be affected from the outside. In Wisdom and Nature 7's view of truth, reality bears no causal relationship to truth. Since Wisdom and Nature 7 seems to be prone to confusion, let me be crystal clear. Reference to reality is not necessary for openness in the sense of incompleteness. Something can be incomplete without being open to reality, without referencing reality. That doesn't mean it will be true. It will simply be incomplete. We've already seen that while rejecting self-reference through the apparatus of metalanguage is sufficient to exclude self-referential paradox, it's overkill because it excludes other perfectly sensible statements and perfectly sensible sets of statements. When you've proven too much, you've proven nothing. So Wisdom and Nature 7 has presented us with no theory which has the clean capacity of the correspondence theory to 1. Resolve paradoxes of self-reference, and 2. Not reject other perfectly sensible statements.
Secondly, Polis claims that my counterexample only applies to formal languages, and that formal languages have little to do with theories which predict and explain observations.
I'm not particularly interested in formal languages because I see philosophy as dealing with human experience and making sense of human experience.
I must say that I find this assertion surprising coming from a retired physicist, as he must have spent a great deal of his career using the formal language of mathematics to predict and explain observations.
As I noted in my video 35, mathematics is abstracted from reality. It is a science, not a language. Linguistic philosophers, such as Wisdom and Nature 7 believes that he is, try to reduce everything to a language. They think that mathematics is a language. But let's compare a real language to mathematics. It's perfectly good English to say a false statement. There's nothing wrong with the English of saying the earth is flat. But in mathematics, saying 2 plus 2 equals 5 is simply bad mathematics. Thus, if there is any analogy between mathematics and a language, it is a very incomplete and inappropriate analogy. Mathematics is a science which is used within the context of other sciences. So, you can follow Wisdom and Nature 7 in proposing a ridiculous theory of knowledge in order to defend your a priori atheistic beliefs. Or, you can be open to reality, look at what people actually say and mean, and have a sensible theory of truth, such as I've proposed.